Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight we're walking into a world where the drink was already poured before you opened your eyes. A world where nobody thought that was strange. A world that will spend the next few hours quietly handing you cup after cup, and then, with a completely straight face, warning you about the dangers of drinking too much. Before we begin, settle in properly, turn the lights down, find the blanket. If you have a fan humming somewhere in the room, even better. And if you're enjoying these journeys, leave a like and consider subscribing, but only if you actually want more of them. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing that this same story is unfolding at breakfast for one of you and at 2 a.m. for another. Now let's go back. You're waking up in a medieval village, not a castle, not a monastery, not a hall hung with banners, a village. The kind of place that appears in no chronicle, produces no chronicler, and would be entirely forgotten if it hadn't been so stubbornly busy staying alive. Your bed is a construction of straw, cloth, and whatever managed to crawl in overnight without asking permission. The room smells of smoke, because the fire has been half alive since yesterday, and nobody has invented the chimney you're imagining. And you're hungry. Breakfast, if your household is doing reasonably well, might be bread, perhaps cheese, perhaps something left from the evening meal that has spent the night developing a personality. And next to it, in a cup that has been repaired more times than anyone can remember, there may be ale. You have been conscious for perhaps 11 minutes. You have accomplished nothing. Nobody in the room considers this remarkable. That's where I want to begin tonight, because that single detail is where the modern imagination goes wrong. We picture medieval drinking as a scene. Torchlight, shouting, a tavern. Someone with a lute nobody asked for. We picture it as an event, something that interrupts ordinary life. But in much of medieval Europe, alcohol wasn't the interruption. It was the background. It sat in the corner of daily existence the way the fire did, or the bread, or the weather. It was simply part of the furniture of being alive. But before we go any further, we need to remove a myth, because it has been sitting in this story for far too long, and it has become extremely comfortable. You have almost certainly heard it. Medieval people drank ale because the water was poison. Every stream a plague, every well a trap. An entire civilization allegedly deciding that hydration was too dangerous to attempt sober. It isn't true. Medieval people drank water. They drank it constantly. They knew perfectly well which springs were good and which were not. They dug wells, they maintained them, they argued about them, and occasionally they went to court over them, which is the most reliable evidence in all of human history that something genuinely mattered. Towns invested serious money in bringing clean water to their populations. Monasteries designed astonishingly clever systems to move water where they wanted it. Manuals on estate management discussed water sources with the seriousness of people who understood exactly what a bad one could do to a household. Nobody stood beside a clear, cold spring in the summer heat, looked at it suspiciously, and reached for a barrel instead. So the myth dies here. Good. Because the truth is much stranger and much more interesting than the myth ever was. The truth is that medieval people drank water and also drank a great deal of ale, and the ale was doing several jobs at once that water simply couldn't do. Start with the most practical one: calories. Think about what your day is going to look like. You may be digging, you may be hauling, you may be cutting, carrying, bending, lifting, walking miles, and repeating all of that until the light goes. There is no machine anywhere in your world that will take a single one of those tasks off your hands. Every unit of work performed in your village today will be performed by a body, and every one of those bodies needs fuel. Ale is fuel. It's made from grain. It's essentially liquid bread with opinions. A weak household ale delivers energy, delivers water, and delivers it in a form that keeps for days when nothing else in your world keeps for anything. And that last point matters more than people realize. Your world has no refrigeration. Preservation is a permanent, exhausting problem that shapes almost every decision your household makes. Milk turns, meat turns, vegetables have a season, and then they don't. But grain stores, and grain converted into ale stores a little longer still, and the fermentation process itself makes the result more stable than the water and grain that went into it. So brewing isn't a hobby, it's storage. It's your household turning one form of survival into another form of survival that lasts a bit longer and tastes considerably better than boiled porridge for the 4th day running. Now, a crucial distinction, because I don't want you leaving tonight with the wrong picture in your head. The everyday household ale we're talking about was often weak. Not always. Strength varied enormously depending on region, century, who was brewing, what it was for, and how much grain the household could spare. But a great deal of ordinary daily ale was small, thin stuff, brewed to be drunk in quantity by people doing hard work, not to remove them from the working day entirely. Having ale with your breakfast did not mean you spent your afternoon delivering a passionate speech to a fence post. That isn't what this story is. You're not living in a society of stumbling drunks. You are living in a society where a mildly alcoholic grain drink sits beside your bread, and nobody finds that worth mentioning, because to them, it isn't. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to escape. Not because the drinking was extreme, but because it was ordinary. So let's follow the ale backwards. Someone made it. Who? You might picture a specialist. A brewer with a workshop, barrels stacked to the ceiling, equipment nobody else understands, a sign hanging outside. And in some places, in some periods, particularly in growing towns, that's exactly what you'd find. But in a great many medieval communities, you don't need to go looking for the brewer. You can simply turn around. Because for much of the medieval period, brewing was domestic work. It happened at home, alongside cooking and baking and every other act of turning raw material into something a family could live on. And overwhelmingly, in England and across much of Northern Europe, it was done by women. So your house, which already contains your sleeping space, your cooking space, your workspace, your children, your stored grain, quite possibly some poultry with strong feelings about boundaries, and at least one object that hasn't been moved or cleaned since the old king died, also contains your brewery. The work itself is genuinely demanding, and I want to give it the respect it deserves because women brewed at home makes it sound casual, and it absolutely was not. Grain has to be malted, which means steeping it, letting it germinate, and then drying it, a process that requires attention, judgment, and a real understanding of what you're doing. It has to be ground. It has to be mixed with heated water in the right proportions at the right temperature, which you're judging without a thermometer, using experience alone. It has to be strained, boiled, cooled, fermented, and stored. And then it has to be drunk reasonably quickly, because unhopped ale does not wait politely for your convenience. It turns. That last detail shapes everything. Because ale spoils fast, a household brewing ale is brewing constantly, not once a season, regularly, repeatedly, forever. Which means alcohol production isn't a distant industrial thing happening somewhere else. It's a recurring domestic rhythm happening in the same room where you eat and sleep and argue about whose turn it is to deal with the chickens. Imagine growing up inside that. You wake and there's ale, you eat and there's ale. And while you're eating, your mother is starting the next batch, because the current one has 3 days left before it becomes an interesting experiment. And here's where it gets more interesting still, because a household that brews well doesn't stop at feeding itself. If your ale is good and word travels, neighbours will want some. And in England, women who brewed and sold ale became known as alewives, or brewsters. The scale varied enormously. Some were selling a surplus a few times a year, a small side income attached to a skill they already had. Others operated something much closer to a genuine business, brewing regularly for a paying local market and making real money doing it. For many women in medieval England, this was one of the most accessible routes to independent income available. No workshop to buy, no guild to enter, no specialist premises. You needed grain, equipment you likely already owned, and the knowledge, which you almost certainly learned from the woman who raised you. So now watch what's happened to the position of alcohol in your world. It's a food, it's a form of storage, it's a household craft, and now it's a source of income, which means a portion of your community has a direct financial interest in its continued existence. And the moment something becomes both universal and profitable, a third party inevitably arrives with a strong opinion about it. Local authorities notice, rules appear, measures are checked, prices are watched, fines are collected. Humanity discovers with tremendous enthusiasm that popular things can be taxed. But we'll get to the paperwork later. For now, the essential point is simply this. Alcohol in medieval life doesn't wait for you behind a tavern door at the end of a hard day. It's already inside your house. It was made in your house. It may be paying for your house. And you're about to leave that house and go to work, where you might reasonably expect a few sober hours. You're going to be disappointed, because your employer, it turns out, has brought refreshments. So you finish your breakfast, you set the cup down, and you step out into the morning. The village is already awake, because villages always are. Somebody's arguing with an animal. Somebody's repairing something that will need repairing again next week. The light is thin and grey and the ground is cold, and ahead of you lies a working day of a length that would cause a modern labour inspector to lie down quietly in a dark room. But you're feeling reasonably optimistic because surely this is where the drinking stops. You have fields to work, you have loads to move, you have tools with edges on them, animals with opinions, ladders with a casual attitude toward gravity, and roughly 14 hours to get through before anyone in human history invents the concept of workplace safety. Concentration seems advisable, and then, at some point during that day, someone hands you a drink. Not secretly, not as a favour, not with a wink and a finger to the lips. Openly, as a matter of routine, in front of everyone, because it is part of the arrangement you agreed to when you took the work. Here's the thing that surprises people most about medieval labour, and it's a genuinely important point rather than just a funny one. In the medieval world, wages were frequently not just money. They were money and food and drink, and often the food and drink portion was substantial. Sometimes it was the larger portion. A labourer hired for a day might receive a lower cash rate specifically because meals were included, and a higher rate if he was expected to feed himself. Estate accounts across medieval Europe record this in dry, patient detail. So much bread, so much cheese or meat or fish, so much ale issued to so many workers on such a day. Somebody, centuries ago, sat down and wrote out how much beer the roofers drank, and then someone else filed it, and then it survived. History is occasionally very generous. This isn't sloppiness or indulgence, it's economics. Think about what an employer actually needs from a harvest worker. He needs a body capable of sustained heavy exertion in the heat, for as many hours of daylight as can be squeezed out of a narrow, terrifying window when the crop is ripe and the weather is a coin toss. If that body runs out of fuel at midday, the employer has lost half a worker. Food and drink supplied on site keep the labour force upright and in the field, rather than wandering home to look for something to eat. And the harvest is the moment when all of this reaches its peak. Harvest was the great crisis of the agricultural year, the period when everything that had been growing for months had to come in fast, before rain or rot or bad luck destroyed it. Every available pair of hands was needed. Wages rose. Provisions became generous. Landlords who were tight-fisted for 11 months of the year suddenly discovered a warm and previously well-hidden hospitality, because a workforce that feels well treated during harvest is a workforce that comes back and works hard. In England, certain harvest work owed to a lord came with a meal provided as part of the customary arrangement, and these occasions could become genuine events, with bread and ale and meat laid on. There was even a name for the sort of duty that came with food attached. The details varied wildly from manor to manor, but the pattern is consistent. Hard collective labour, followed by collective eating and drinking, paid for by the person who benefited from the labour. So picture your first day. You arrive early, someone shows you where to stand, someone gives you a tool and a brief, unhelpful explanation of how to use it. Someone tells you which end of the field to start at, and then someone brings out the ale, at which point you may quietly wonder whether you have accidentally applied to work at a festival. But notice the shape of what's happening here, because it's the thing that makes medieval drinking culture so genuinely different from ours. In the modern world, alcohol is what comes after work. It is the reward, the boundary, the marker that says the labour is finished, and you may now stop being a productive person. The whole idea of the drink after work depends on the drink being separate from work. In the medieval world, that boundary doesn't exist in the same way. Alcohol appears during the work. It's not the reward at the end of the shift. It's the fuel that gets you through it. It is sitting in a jug at the edge of the field with a cloth over it, and it is there for the same reason the bread is there. And once again, this only functions because we're mostly talking about weak ale. Handing a harvest crew a jug of small beer at 10 in the morning does not immediately convert a wheat field into an incident. The workers are expected to keep working, which is, from their perspective, extremely inconsiderate of everyone. Now let's move indoors, because if you work inside a household rather than out in a field, the arrangement becomes even more total. Servants in wealthy medieval households were typically maintained rather than simply paid. That word is doing a lot of work. Maintenance meant the household fed you, clothed you to some degree, housed you, and provided your daily drink, on top of whatever cash wage you received, which might be modest indeed. You lived inside the economy of the house. Your food came from its kitchens, your bed was under its roof, and your ale came from its brewhouse. And large households had brewhouses, serious ones. A great noble or royal household could get through genuinely enormous quantities of ale and beer. because it was feeding dozens or hundreds of people every single day, and the household accounts of such places record allowances of drink for staff as a completely routine line of expenditure. There were people whose entire job existed within this system: brewers and their assistants, the officers responsible for the buttery and the cellar, the men who managed casks and measures and stores. So if you serve in a great house, the alcohol you drink was made a short walk from where you sleep by someone you see every day, and it arrives to you as an entitlement, not a purchase. You don't buy it, you are owed it. Your compensation package, then, consists of a place to sleep, food, drink, and the exciting possibility of surviving the winter, dental care not included. And here is where the psychological effect starts to accumulate, which is really the heart of tonight's story. It isn't that any single one of these arrangements is shocking, it's that they stack. You had ale at home because your household made it and it was food. You have ale at work because your employer supplies it and it's part of your wage. You have not gone looking for either. You have not made a single decision. You have simply woken up and gone about your day, and alcohol has been placed into your hands twice by people who consider themselves to be doing something entirely unremarkable, and who would be genuinely puzzled if you objected. Now let's ask the uncomfortable question, because it's the question this whole series is circling. Suppose you are a person for whom drink is a problem. Suppose you are the one in your village whose relationship with ale has gone somewhere dark. What are your options? You cannot avoid it at home because your home is where it's made. You cannot avoid it at work because it arrives as part of your wage, and refusing it doesn't get you more money instead. It just gets you a strange look and a reputation. You could refuse, but refusal has costs. In a community where everyone knows everyone, and where reputation functions as a kind of currency, being the person who won't take what's offered is being the person about whom questions get asked. Are you ill? Are you fasting for some reason nobody's heard about? Are you making a point? Do you think you're better than the rest of the crew? Every refusal is a small public statement, and you will be making that statement several times a day for the rest of your life in front of the same people. Medieval society did not build support structures for this. There was no vocabulary for it in the sense we'd recognise. There was moral condemnation of the drunkard, which we'll come to in a later section, and which was fierce and unsparing, but that is not the same thing as help. You could be shamed for failing. You could not be assisted in not failing. And this is the fundamental strangeness at the centre of the whole picture. The society is not encouraging you to drink to excess. It disapproves of that, loudly and repeatedly and from several directions at once. It is simply making the alternative structurally difficult to the point of near impossibility and then holding you personally responsible for the outcome. But you're not ready to accept that yet. You've been surprised at breakfast and surprised again at work, and you're beginning to suspect the whole world is in on it. So you decide to go somewhere serious, somewhere disciplined, somewhere that has spent centuries thinking carefully about self-denial, about the appetites of the body, about the sin of excess and the virtue of restraint. You decide to go to the church. Better still, you decide to go to a monastery, where men have voluntarily given up property, family, comfort, and freedom of movement in pursuit of spiritual discipline. Men who rise in the middle of the night to pray, men who eat sparingly, speak rarely, and own nothing. Surely at last here is refuge. So you walk up the road toward those gates, past the fields, the monk's farm, past the walls they built, and you prepare yourself for an atmosphere of holy sobriety. And somewhere behind those walls, a monk with excellent technical training and a substantial daily allowance is checking on the beer. The gates of a medieval monastery are a genuine threshold, and everyone in the medieval world understood that. Step through them, and you are leaving one kind of life and entering another, one governed by different hours, different rules, different silences. Outside, the world is loud and negotiable. Inside, everything runs on a schedule that was written down centuries ago and has not been up for discussion since. So you approach with a certain hope in your chest, because if there is one institution in your entire civilization built on the deliberate refusal of physical appetite, it is this one. You know what monks are for. They pray. They rise at hours no reasonable person would tolerate. They eat less than you do and enjoy it less. They have surrendered property, sex, family, ambition, travel, and the right to make most decisions about their own lives. Their entire existence is a structured argument against indulgence. You're going to be very fond of this place. Then you are shown around, and somewhere between the church and the granary you find the brewhouse. It is not hidden. It is not shameful. It is a substantial, purpose-built, well-equipped facility, staffed by men who know exactly what they are doing. producing beer on a scale that would embarrass most villages, and it appears on the monastery's plans right alongside the bakehouse and the kitchen, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Which to them it is. Let's deal with the obvious reaction first and get it out of the way, because the joke writes itself and it's also wrong. This is not hypocrisy. It is not monks sneaking around behind the abbot's back. The abbot knows. The abbot has approved the budget. The abbot has a daily allowance of his own, probably a larger one than yours, and he does not consider this to be in tension with anything he believes. To understand why, you have to understand something that the modern mind finds slippery, and it's the single most important idea in tonight's entire story: medieval Christianity. Christianity did not condemn alcohol, it condemned drunkenness. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction is not a loophole, it sits right at the centre of the tradition. Wine is not some regrettable worldly substance that religion tolerates through gritted teeth. Wine is at the heart of Christian worship. It appears in the Gospels at a wedding, and it appears at the Last Supper, and it appears every single day on every altar in Christendom. The Mass requires it. A church without wine is a church that cannot function. You cannot build a religion around a sacrament involving wine and then declare the substance itself sinful. What you can do, and what the tradition did, with enormous energy and considerable eloquence, is condemn the loss of self-control. Drunkenness was attacked because of what it does to a person. It dissolves reason, and reason is what makes you capable of governing yourself, and a person who cannot govern himself will be led into everything else. Gluttony, lust, anger, violence, neglect of duty. Drunkenness was dangerous not as an endpoint but as a doorway. So the moral logic runs: the drink is good, the excess is sin, and the whole burden falls on the drinker to know the difference. Hold on to that, because it explains everything that follows tonight. Now, why does the monastery actually need a brewhouse? Not as a matter of theology, but as a matter of logistics. Start with the fact that a monastery is a residential community that never empties. There are, depending on the house, dozens or occasionally hundreds of monks, plus lay brothers who do much of the manual labour, plus servants, plus craftsmen, plus whoever is currently working on the endless building projects. All of these people eat every day, and all of them drink every day, and the monastery has to supply it. Monastic rules actually specify this. The Rule of St. Benedict, which shaped Western monasticism for centuries, discusses the daily allowance of drink directly. It acknowledges wine, expresses reservations about it, notes that monks in the past would not touch it, concedes that the monks of his own day cannot be persuaded of that, and then sets out a measured daily portion with the observation that everyone should have it in moderation, and that those who can abstain will be rewarded. It also allows the abbot to increase the ration when circumstances demand heat, heavy labour, and warns sternly against drunkenness. Read that carefully, because it's a remarkable document. It is not permission granted reluctantly by a lax institution. It's a realistic accommodation written by someone who understood exactly what human beings are like, and who chose regulation over prohibition. Give them a fixed measure, make the measure known, condemn what lies beyond it. The medieval church's answer to alcohol over and over again is not removal, it's portion control. And then there's geography, which is where beer comes in. Wine is easy if you live somewhere grapes grow. Much of southern Europe brews very little because it doesn't need to. But move north, into England, into the Low Countries, into much of Germany, into Scandinavia, and grapes become difficult, unreliable, or impossible. Wine must then be imported at cost, which makes it expensive and for daily consumption by an entire community impractical. So the northern houses did what everyone in the north did. They brewed. Grain grew where grapes wouldn't. Where? The daily allowance became ale or beer instead of wine, and the brew house became as essential as the mill. Then add hospitality, which is where the volume becomes serious. Monasteries were obliged to receive guests. This wasn't optional courtesy. It was a religious duty rooted in the instruction to receive the stranger as Christ himself. In a world with no hotel industry to speak of, monasteries functioned as the infrastructure of travel. Pilgrims stopped there, merchants stopped there. Nobles arrived with retinues, horses, and expectations. The poor came to the gate for alms and food. Every one of those people needed feeding, and every one of them needed something to drink. A monastery on a major pilgrimage route was, functionally, a hostel operating at scale, and the brewhouse was the department keeping it supplied. And monasteries were exceptionally well positioned to do this properly, which is the part people underestimate. Consider what a large monastic house actually possessed. Land, often extensive, frequently the best managed land in the region. Its own grain supply, so no need to buy raw materials. Mills, storage buildings, organized, disciplined labor, sophisticated water management, because monastic engineers were genuinely excellent at moving water where they wanted it. And brewing is a process that demands water in quantity, at the right place, at the right time, and above all, continuity. This is the real advantage. A household brewer learns from her mother and passes it to her daughter, and if the chain breaks, the knowledge goes with it. A monastery does not die. Its members die. The institution persists. Techniques get written down. Records get kept. Failures get remembered. A house could refine its methods across 200 years, and the man brewing in a given decade was standing on generations of accumulated, documented experience. That's not a monk throwing grain into a bucket and asking a saint to supervise the chemistry. That is organized technical production, and it's a genuine reason why monastic brewing developed a reputation for quality that has survived into the present day. There's also the matter of surplus. A house producing at that scale, with that reliability, will sometimes produce more than it consumes, and monasteries were not shy about selling. Monastic estates were economic enterprises, often large ones, and the sale or exchange of surplus drink connected religious institutions directly to the commercial world of alcohol. The abbey was a producer, a distributor, and quietly a beneficiary of demand. So you stand in the middle of the cloister, having come here specifically to escape the presence of drink, and you find that you have walked into one of the more competent breweries in the region. There's something almost beautiful about the daily rhythm of it. In the morning, the community prays against temptation and the weakness of the flesh. In the afternoon, someone goes to check whether the fermentation is proceeding correctly. And nobody involved sees a contradiction, because there isn't one, by their reckoning. The drink is a good thing given by God, prepared with care, distributed by measure, consumed within limits set by a rule that everyone has agreed to live under. But now step back and look at your own position, because it has quietly deteriorated. You have now encountered alcohol in the home, where it was food, in the workplace, where it was wages, and in the monastery, where it is a regulated daily allowance woven into a life of religious discipline. 3 institutions, 3 completely different sets of values, 3 entirely respectable justifications, and in every single case the answer is the same. Yes, of course there is drink. Why would there not be? You are starting to understand something uncomfortable. There is no corner of this civilization that has been designed without it. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because it grew into everything at once, quietly, from 100 separate directions, each one perfectly reasonable on its own terms. At this point, sobriety has stopped feeling like a personal choice, and has started to feel like a scavenger hunt with no prize at the end. Still, there is one more authority you haven't consulted. One more figure whose entire professional purpose is the well-being of your body, who examines you, who studies the ancient texts, who understands the balance of health better than any priest or landlord ever could. Your physician. Surely a man of medicine will finally tell you to stop. So you go to him with your complaint, the fever, the aching joints, the strange lingering weakness, and you describe your symptoms, and he listens carefully and thinks about it seriously, and then he reaches a professional conclusion. He recommends wine. Let's be clear about who you're going to see, because physician in the medieval world covers an enormous range of people, and which one you get depends almost entirely on your money. At the top sits the university-trained physician. He has studied for years. He has read Greek and Arabic authorities in Latin translation. He costs a great deal, and he is not going to be treating a village labourer with a cough. Below him are surgeons, who work with their hands and are regarded with less prestige for exactly that reason. Below them, barber surgeons, who will shave you, pull your tooth, and bleed you, sometimes in that order. And beyond all of them, doing most of the actual medical work of the medieval world are local healers, wise women, apothecaries, herbalists, midwives, and whichever relative in your household has a reputation for knowing what to do about a fever. But whichever one you consult and whatever their training, there is a decent chance that wine enters the conversation at some point, and when it does, it is not a joke, and it is not laziness. It is the direct logical output of the most sophisticated medical theory available to them. To understand why, you need to understand humoral medicine. which governed European thinking about the body for well over 1,000 years. The idea, inherited from Greek medicine and transmitted through Roman writers, then preserved, expanded and refined by scholars in the Islamic world before returning to Europe, in Latin translation, went roughly like this. The body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each is associated with qualities drawn from pairs of opposites: hot or cold, wet or dry. Health is balance. Illness is imbalance. Treatment therefore means identifying what has gone out of proportion and pushing it back the other way. And crucially, everything possessed these qualities. Not just people, foods had them, drinks had them, herbs, spices, seasons, climates, ages, occupations, times of day. The physician's task was to read the patient and then adjust the inputs, which is why a medieval consultation does not begin the way you'd expect. He doesn't just ask what hurts. He wants to know your age, your usual diet, your sleep, your work, your bowels, your temperament, what season it is, what the weather has been doing, and, if he's the expensive sort, what the planets have been up to. Because astrology and medicine were entangled, and no respectable physician of the higher class would have regarded that as unscientific. Then he examines your urine, extensively. The urine flask became the visual symbol of the medieval physician, the way the stethoscope is ours. Colour, sediment, clarity, and yes, sometimes smell and taste, all interpreted as a window into the internal state of the body, and then he prescribes. Wine, within this system, was understood as warming. It was thought to heat the body, strengthen it, aid digestion, restore vitality, and generate good blood. So if your condition was read as excessively cold, if you were weak, chilled, elderly, exhausted, convalescing, wasting away, then something warming is precisely what the theory demands. Different wines carried different characteristics. Strong dark reds were considered more heating than thin whites. Sweet wines behaved differently from sour ones. New wine differed from aged. A physician could therefore prescribe not merely wine, but a specific type of wine, in a specific quantity, at a specific time of day, sometimes diluted with water in a specified proportion for a specific complaint. This was not vague folk advice. It was a system with rules, and practitioners applied it with genuine rigour. There was also a second, entirely practical role, and this one holds up rather better under modern scrutiny. Wine was a solvent and a preservative. If you want to extract the active properties of a plant, water will only take you so far. Alcohol pulls out compounds that water leaves behind, and the resulting preparation keeps far longer than a water infusion, which spoils within days. So across medieval pharmacy, herbs were steeped, infused, and macerated in wine to make medicinal preparations. Wine was the delivery mechanism, and it was used externally too. Wine was applied to wounds, poured on, used to wash, used to soak dressings, a practice inherited directly from ancient surgical writing. Nobody involved had a theory of infection or any notion of microorganisms. They simply observed, across an enormous number of cases and many centuries, that wounds treated this way often did better than wounds that weren't. They were, entirely by accident and for reasons they could not possibly have articulated, applying a mild antiseptic. Which is the thing that gets lost when this period is treated as a comedy of ignorance. A great deal of medieval practice was wrong, some of it was actively harmful, but a great deal of it was accumulated empirical observation, tested across generations, and some of it worked, even when every word of the explanation attached to it was mistaken. So you have now reached a genuinely extraordinary position in this story. You can drink and describe it as following medical advice. Humanity is going to enjoy that phrase for the next 800 years, and it is never going to get old. Now, before this becomes a caricature, the necessary correction, because medieval medical writers were not fools, and they were not permissive. They warned about drinking, constantly. The same authorities who prescribed wine also insisted on moderation as a medical principle, not merely a moral one. Excess consumption was understood to damage the body, cloud the mind, harm the stomach, and shorten life. Regimens of health, the popular medieval guides to staying well, of which there were many, treated diet and drink as the foundation of good health, and consistently advised restraint. Wine was recommended in measure. Wine was warned against in quantity. Both statements sat comfortably in the same book, often on the same page. There were also cautions about who should drink. Wine was generally considered unsuitable in strength for children, on the grounds that their natures were already warm and moist and did not need heating further. It was regarded as more appropriate for the elderly, whose bodies were understood to be cooling and drying with age. Dilution with water was routine advice, and undiluted strong wine was frequently treated as something closer to a drug than a drink. So your physician is not diagnosing a sore knee and prescribing 12 pints. He is doing something considerably more careful than that, and he would be offended by the suggestion. But look at the effect on your situation anyway. The point isn't that medicine ordered you to drink. The point is that the most learned, most authoritative, most intellectually respected body of knowledge in your entire world has just placed alcohol in the category of things that are good for the human body when properly used. And that is a license of a very particular kind. It doesn't just permit drinking, it dignifies it. Because now you can arrange your entire life around a set of unimpeachable explanations. The ale at breakfast is nourishment. The ale in the field is your wage. The beer at the abbey is a religious allowance under an ancient rule. And the wine in the evening is a matter of health, prescribed by an educated man who studied the authorities and examined your urine and gave the question serious thought. Imagine trying to explain this to a concerned friend from another century. You've been drinking every single day. Medicinal. You had ale before sunrise. Nutritional. Your employer gave you more at midday. Contractual. And the monks? Institutional. There's a written rule about it. There's a measure. Medieval society has handed you the most complete administrative defense in the history of human self-justification, and it did so entirely sincerely, with no intention of enabling anything at all. But here's the thing about the physician. He's avoidable. Most people in the medieval world consulted a trained physician rarely or never, because most people couldn't afford one. If you genuinely wanted to remove medicine from your list of routes to alcohol, you could simply decline to be treated, suffer bravely, and hope. So there's a version of you that walks out of this consultation feeling like a corner has been turned. Home is a problem, work is a problem, the church is a problem. But medicine, at least, can be avoided by the straightforward method of not getting ill in a manner that requires expert attention. You go home, you shut the door, you sit down in the quiet of your own house with your own fire, and you resolve that this evening will be different. And then somebody knocks. It might be a traveller who needs a bed. It might be a neighbour with a question about a boundary. It might be a relative you have complicated feelings about. It might be a man who has come to discuss money he either owes you or intends to owe you shortly. Whoever it is, they are now standing in your doorway, in a world where turning a person away from your threshold is not a minor social awkwardness, but a genuine mark against your character, in a community where character is the only credit rating you will ever have. You step aside, you let them in. And in that moment, before either of you has said anything of substance, an obligation settles over the room that is older than the church, older than the manor, older than any law your kingdom has ever written down. You are the host, they are the guest, and a host offers a drink. The door is open, the guest is inside, and now you are operating under a set of rules that nobody in your village has ever written down, and everybody knows perfectly. Hospitality in the medieval world is not politeness. That word is far too weak and far too modern. Politeness is optional. Hospitality was closer to law, sometimes literally, in certain codes and customs, but more importantly it was moral law, the kind enforced by everyone you will ever meet for the rest of your life. To understand why it mattered so much, look at the world your guest just walked out of. He has been travelling on roads that are not really roads, in weather that has no interest in his schedule, on foot or on a horse, carrying what he could manage. There are no signs telling him how far he has left to go. There is nothing to book in advance and no way to book it. If darkness catches him between settlements, he is sleeping outside in a landscape that contains weather, wolves in some regions, and men who have noticed that travellers carry things. Nobody has invented the safety net that a modern traveller assumes without thinking. The safety net is other people's doors. So the whole system of medieval travel runs on an unspoken arrangement. You take in the stranger, because next month, or next year, in some other village where nobody knows your name, you will be the stranger. Hospitality is a form of insurance paid in advance, by everyone, forever. Break the arrangement and you have not merely been rude, you have chipped away at the thing that makes movement possible at all, and on top of that practical foundation sits a religious one, heavy and constant. Christianity places extraordinary emphasis on receiving the stranger. The instruction to welcome and feed those who arrive at your door is repeated in Scripture, preached from pulpits, embedded in monastic rules, and generally understood as one of the plainest duties a Christian has. There's a persistent idea running through the tradition that the guest at your threshold might be more than he seems, and that hospitality is offered to God through the person of whoever is standing in front of you, which raises the stakes on a knock at the door considerably. So the guest is in, and the first act of hospitality, the one that happens before conversation, before business, before you've even established why he's come, is the offer of something to eat and drink. Now, why drink specifically? Why is that the gesture? Partly because it's immediate. A meal takes preparation. A bed takes arrangement. A cup can be filled and placed in a man's hand within seconds of him sitting down, which means it is the fastest possible way of converting a stranger into a guest. It closes the awkward gap. It says, before anyone has to find words, you are welcome here, and I am not going to make you ask. Partly because it's shared. This is the deeper thing. You and your guest are drinking the same drink, from the same supply, in the same room. In a society where poison was a genuine anxiety among the powerful and where trust between strangers had to be built from nothing, the act of consuming the same thing together carries meaning that goes well beyond refreshment. It's a small demonstration of good faith performed with the body rather than the mouth, and partly because what you serve says something about you, which is where this gets interesting. Because the drink you offer is a message, and everyone present can read it. If you're a modest household, you offer your own ale, the stuff brewed in this room, from your own grain, by your own hands. That's not an apology. It's actually a rather serious statement, because you are giving away something that cost your household labour, and grain it can't easily spare. Generosity is measured relative to means, and everyone knows what your means are. If you're wealthy and your guest is important, the calculation changes entirely. Now you have options, and the options are the point. You might serve wine, and if you live somewhere wine doesn't grow, England, much of the north, then every cup of it announces that it was purchased, that it travelled, that it passed through the hands of merchants and carters and shipmasters, that it survived a journey and paid its tolls along the way. Your host is not saying, here is a drink. Your host is saying, here is a drink that required a vineyard I do not own, a ship I do not sail, 3 merchants, several taxes, and at least 1 horse that had a genuinely difficult month. That is status, and it is being served in a cup. Because this is a world without most of the ways we display wealth. There's no bank statement to mention casually. Land is impressive, but it's outside and it can't be brought to the table. Clothing does some of the work, certainly, but clothing is worn, not shared. Drink is the perfect vehicle. It is consumed in the moment, in company, in front of witnesses, and it is gone by morning, which makes serving it again tomorrow an even louder statement than serving it once. So alcohol has now acquired yet another function in your world. It is a language. And now, standing in the middle of all this, is you, the person trying not to drink. Watch how badly this goes. The cup is offered. You decline. Immediately something has gone wrong in the room and you can feel it. Your host will assume first that you're being polite, that you don't want to take from a household that may not have much. So he offers again, more firmly, because pressing the offer is itself part of the ritual. Refusing once is almost expected. Refusing twice is a message, so you decline again. And now the room begins to work through the possibilities, because there must be a reason, and the possible reasons are not flattering. Are you ill? That's the kindest interpretation, and it comes with follow-up questions. Are you fasting? Fasting is honourable and completely legible in this world, but fasts belong to particular days and seasons, and everyone present knows what day it is. An unexplained private fast suggests either extraordinary personal devotion, which invites scrutiny, or penance, which invites the question of what exactly you did. Do you think the drink isn't good enough? This is the interpretation that will actually damage you, because it insults the household. Do you distrust the host? In a world where shared consumption signals trust, refusing to share can be read as its opposite. Or, and this is the one that stings, are you known to have a problem, and is this a public admission of it? Every one of those readings cost you something. And here's the part that makes the situation genuinely inescapable, rather than merely awkward. You cannot correct it. There is no explanation available to you that this society will accept as reasonable. The concept you would need, that you personally have a relationship with drink that requires total avoidance rather than moderation. does not exist as a recognized category. There is the moderate drinker, who is normal. There is the drunkard, who is sinful and weak. There is the ascetic, who is holy. There is no fourth option, and certainly no neutral one. So you either drink, or you accept the slow accumulation of a reputation you can't shape. And this happens in your own house, which is the cruelty of it. Home, in the modern imagination, is where you control what comes through the door. In this world, home is where hospitality is performed, which means home is the place where you are least free to refuse. Now let's follow the ritual a step further, because hospitality has a natural momentum built into it. A good host does not let a cup sit empty. That's a failure of attention, and attentiveness is the whole substance of hosting well. So he watches, and he refills. That's his job. And a good guest does not refuse a refill from a generous host, because refusing implies the hospitality was excessive, which implies criticism, which is the one thing a guest must never offer. So the host pours because hosting requires it. The guest accepts because being a guest requires it. Neither man is making a decision about how much he wants to drink. Both are performing roles correctly, and 2 hours later, both of them have performed those roles beautifully, and are now conducting a detailed and increasingly emotional discussion with a piece of furniture. Medieval moralists noticed this exact mechanism and complained about it bitterly. Preachers understood perfectly well that generosity could be the engine of excess, that the pressure of the table could carry a man far past where he'd have stopped on his own. The complaint appears again and again in sermons and moral writing, that people are drinking not from thirst but from courtesy, and that courtesy is a poor reason to lose your senses. But identifying the mechanism did not dismantle it, because the mechanism was made of virtues. You cannot remove hospitality from a society without removing something that society genuinely needs. So the moralists condemned the outcome while the culture kept producing it, which is a pattern you're going to see over and over before tonight is finished. And notice what has happened to your list of explanations, because it keeps growing. The drink is food. The drink is wages. The drink is a religious allowance. The drink is medicine. And now the drink is manners. It is how you honour a guest, prove your generosity, display your standing, and demonstrate that you are a person who can be trusted. 5 categories. 5 different institutions, not one of them created for the purpose of putting alcohol in your hand, and every single one of them doing exactly that. But there's a 6th waiting, and it might be the most respectable of all. Because tomorrow you have serious business. You need to sell grain, or settle a debt, or agree a price, or hire a man, or buy an animal. This is money. This is careful, sober, consequential adult work, and surely nobody conducts that over a drink. You'll want somewhere neutral to meet. Somewhere both parties can reach, somewhere with a table and light and people around to witness the agreement. There is exactly one such building in your community, and it sells ale. Let's start by fixing a mental image, because the word tavern has been thoroughly ruined by 400 years of fiction, and you're almost certainly picturing the wrong building. You are picturing something with a carved wooden sign, a roaring fire, a long polished bar, a man in an apron polishing a tankard with a cloth, and a hooded stranger in the corner who is about to change your life. That building is largely an invention of later centuries and popular imagination. The reality in most of medieval Europe was more modest and considerably more interesting. For much of the period, and especially in villages and smaller towns, the place you went to drink was not a purpose-built establishment at all. It was somebody's house. A household that had brewed a batch would put out a sign, traditionally a pole or bush hung outside the door, indicating that ale was available now, this week, while it lasted. Neighbours came in, sat down in a domestic room, drank and went home. Then the ale ran out, the sign came down, and the house went back to being a house until the next batch. That is the alehouse in its original form. Temporary, domestic, informal, and run more often than not by a woman. It appears and disappears with the brewing cycle. It has no fixed identity because it doesn't need one. Above that sat the inn, which was a genuinely different thing. Inns were larger, permanent, commercial, and concentrated in towns and along major routes. They provided beds, stabling for horses, food, storage for goods, and a place for travelling merchants to conduct business. An inn was infrastructure. Innkeepers could be substantial figures in a town, well capitalised and socially respectable, because running one required real investment. And in between and alongside sat the tavern, which in many regions specifically meant a place selling wine rather than ale. and which therefore attracted a different clientele and a different price point. The distinctions blurred constantly, varied by region and century, and nobody was policing the vocabulary, but the important thing is the range. This was not one type of building. It was a whole spectrum of places running from a woman's front room to a serious commercial establishment with a courtyard and a cellar. And every single one of them was functionally the community's only public indoor space that wasn't a church. Sit with that for a moment, because it explains everything that follows. Your village has a church. It's a magnificent building, it's the centre of communal life, and there are things you cannot do inside it. You cannot conduct a heated negotiation over the price of a cow. You cannot play dice. You cannot sit for 3 hours gossiping about your neighbour's failed harvest. The church has a purpose, and it is not that. Your home is your home, and inviting someone into it carries all the weight we discussed: obligation, hospitality, cost. There is no town hall in the modern sense, no library, no cafe, no office. Outdoors is available, and outdoors is used constantly. But outdoors in Northern Europe from October to April is a hostile environment with poor acoustics. So where does a community actually meet? It meets where the ale is, not because anyone designed it that way, but because that was the room with a roof, a fire, seating, light, and no obligation attached to entering. Which brings us to business. Suppose you need to sell your surplus grain, or hire a man for a week's work, or agree the terms on a piece of land, or settle a debt that has been souring for months. Where do you go? You go to the alehouse or the inn, and this is not a failure of seriousness. It's the correct venue, and here's why. First, neutrality. If you meet in my house, I'm the host and you're the guest, and that relationship carries all sorts of implications that will quietly bend the negotiation. A public room belongs to neither of us. We meet as equals. Second, and far more important, witnesses. You are living in a world where most agreements are not written. Literacy is limited, notaries are expensive and often distant, and parchment is not something you use casually. So how does an agreement become real? It becomes real because people saw it happen. An agreement made in a crowded public room, in front of a dozen neighbours who know both parties, is enforceable in a way a private handshake never is. If you later claim you agreed to a different price, 6 people will remember otherwise, and in a community where reputation determines whether anyone will ever trade with you again, 6 people remembering otherwise is a devastating sanction. Manorial and borough court records are full of disputes where the testimony that mattered was simply that men had been present and had heard what was said. The tavern, then, is not a distraction from serious business. It is the legal infrastructure of serious business. It is where contracts are made valid by being made publicly, and once you're there, the drink appears, and now we can see why. The drink is the price of admission to the room. It's what makes your presence there legitimate rather than strange. And it's the ritual that opens the negotiation, because you don't begin by naming a figure. You begin by sitting down together and sharing something, which establishes that you are 2 men doing business rather than 2 men trying to get the better of each other. Then you talk about the weather, then prices, then taxes at length and with feeling, then eventually the matter at hand. Humanity has achieved almost perfect continuity with the modern business lunch. The only real difference is that nobody has a slide deck. But the room offers something even more valuable than a venue for your transaction, and this is the part one finds genuinely fascinating. It is your only source of news. Try to imagine an information environment this narrow. You have no newspaper, no post you'd ever receive, no way of knowing what is happening 10 miles away unless a person physically walks from there to here and tells you. Your knowledge of the world beyond the horizon is composed entirely of what other human beings have carried into your village on foot. And where do those people stop? They stop where travellers stop. They stop at the inn. So you walk into that room and you are walking into the local node of a continent-wide information network. A merchant knows what prices did at the last fair. A carter knows which bridge is out and which road is dangerous. A traveller from 2 counties over knows whose lord has died. A soldier knows what he saw. A pilgrim knows what was being said in the last town. Whether any of it is accurate is an entirely separate question, and frequently the answer is no. Because also present, without fail, is 1 man in the corner who knows precisely what the king is planning, in detail, with confidence, despite having never in his life travelled more than a day's walk from the place he was born. Some things are genuinely eternal. So you sit down intending to conclude 1 piece of business, and you leave 3 hours later, knowing which family is quarrelling with which, whose daughter is being married and to whom, whose harvest failed, Which merchant has developed an unfortunate reputation for vanishing shortly after being paid, and precisely whose cow got into whose field on Tuesday? You have not been idling. You have been gathering intelligence essential to your economic survival, because in a world of personal credit and personal reputation, knowing who can be trusted is not gossip. It's due diligence. The drink simply keeps arriving while you do it. And that's the mechanism, quietly, without anyone intending it. You didn't come because you wanted to drink. You came because this is where the information is, where the people are, where the deals happen. The alcohol is incidental to your purpose and central to your afternoon. Naturally, authorities were entirely aware that these rooms produced trouble as well as business. Take a group of men, add competitive drinking, add dice, and gambling was ubiquitous and enormously popular. Add money-changing hands, add existing grudges, add a room with no exit strategy, and outcomes become predictable. Court records across medieval Europe are thick with cases originating in drinking houses, assaults, thefts, cheating at dice, brawls that started over a debt and ended with someone's head opened. Which is why alehouses and taverns attracted regulation with such persistence. But we'll come to the paperwork properly later, and it deserves its own section, because the response of authority to all this is the single most revealing thing in tonight's entire story. For now, note what your position has become. The alehouse is your bar. It is also your restaurant, your meeting room, your newsroom, your employment exchange, your courthouse by proxy, your entertainment venue, your bank of local reputation, and on certain evenings, your boxing ring. It is not one institution, it is 9 institutions sharing a roof and a barrel. And a man who decides to avoid it is not merely giving up drinking, he is withdrawing from the economy, the information network, and the social life of his own community in a single decision. He'll be the last to know everything. He'll miss the work that was arranged on Tuesday. He'll not be there when the agreement is witnessed. Choosing not to go isn't self-discipline, it's exile. But suppose you manage it anyway. Suppose you hold out, keep your head down, work your land, and stay away from the room where everything happens. You still cannot escape because the calendar is coming for you. Because somewhere in the parish, a date is approaching that everyone has been counting toward. The harvest is nearly in. A wedding has been arranged. A Saint's Day sits waiting on the church calendar as it has every year since before anyone can remember. The whole community is about to gather. And when a medieval community gathers to celebrate, there is exactly one thing it does first. Someone opens a barrel. You wake up and the village feels different. You can hear it before you see it. There's an energy in the air that doesn't belong to an ordinary morning, and somewhere behind it, the unmistakable sound of preparation. Today is a feast day. And here is something people consistently underestimate about medieval life: the sheer number of them. We tend to picture the Middle Ages as unrelenting toil, a grey procession of labour from birth to grave. But the medieval calendar was studded with holy days, and on those days work was restricted or forbidden. The exact count varied enormously by region, century and diocese, and the rules were bent constantly when the harvest demanded it. But the total number of days on which ordinary labour was set aside was substantial, considerably more than a modern worker's holiday allowance. The medieval year was not a flat line, it had a shape, and the shape was punctuated by celebration. There was the great architecture of the church year, Christmas running for its full 12 days, and the long solemn stretch of Lent, and then Easter arriving with genuine explosive relief after weeks of fasting. Whitsun, All Saints. And then, layered on top of that universal framework, the local one, the feast of the saint to whom your own church was dedicated, which was your parish's own day, celebrated with more enthusiasm than any other, because it belonged to you specifically. Then add the agricultural year on top of that, the end of harvest, the start of ploughing, the dates when livestock came in or went out. These were not religious occasions, but they were communal ones, and they were marked. Then add the events of individual lives, weddings, baptisms, funerals, and yes, funerals, because a proper burial in medieval England meant food and drink provided for the mourners, sometimes generously, sometimes leaving instructions in a will about exactly what was to be served. Grief was communal, and it was catered. Then add fairs, which brought outsiders, traders, entertainers, and money into your community for a few days each year. Then add guild feasts if you belonged to a craft or a religious fraternity, which many townspeople did, and which typically held an annual dinner as one of the central obligations of membership. Stack all of that together and the picture that emerges is of a year, with a great many days on which the community stopped, gathered and ate together. And every single one of them involved drink. Now why? Why is the barrel automatic? Partly for the obvious reason. Ale is the drink of the community and celebration means abundance. And abundance means having more than you strictly need of something that cost real grain to make. In a world where scarcity is the permanent background condition, the whole meaning of a feast is the temporary suspension of scarcity. You're eating meat you don't normally eat and drinking stronger ale than you normally drink, and the point is precisely that this is not how you live the rest of the year. Because strength varied by occasion. A household producing week daily ale would brew something considerably stronger for a celebration. The everyday stuff and the festival stuff were not the same drink, and everybody knew which was which the moment the cup arrived. But there's a more specific mechanism, and in England it had an actual name and an actual purpose: the church ale. This was a fundraising event and it worked beautifully. The parish would brew, often using grain donated by parishioners, and then sell the ale to the community at a gathering held in the churchyard or a parish building. The proceeds went to the parish, repairing the church roof, buying candles and vestments, maintaining the fabric of the building, sometimes relieving the poor of the parish. Read that again, because it is one of the more remarkable facts in this entire story. Across late medieval England, a significant portion of the money that maintained parish churches was raised by selling beer. And there were variations on the theme: bride ales, where a couple starting out would brew and sell ale to raise money toward the costs of establishing a household, a communal subsidy for a young marriage, delivered through a barrel, help ales, raising funds for a neighbour who had suffered misfortune. This is charity organised as a drinking party, and it is not a scandal. It is a community that has recognised something entirely correct, that people give more readily when they're enjoying themselves together, and that a fundraiser which is also a good time raises more than a fundraiser which is a duty. So the barrel isn't just present at the celebration. In many cases, the barrel is the reason the celebration exists. Now, what does this do to you? Personally, it introduces something we haven't encountered yet in this story, and it's the most powerful force so far. Every previous encounter has been an offer. Your household offered breakfast, your employer offered provisions, your host offered a cup. All of those were, technically, refusable at some social cost. A festival is different because a festival is participation. The whole community is present. The whole community is drinking, and the drinking is not incidental to the event, it is the event. The shared act that converts a crowd of individuals into a village celebrating together. To hold a cup is to be part of it. To not hold one is to be visibly, publicly outside it, in front of everyone you know, on a day when the entire point is that nobody is outside it. And crucially, the normal restraints are lifted. This is what makes festivals dangerous in a way ordinary days aren't. Everyone understands that a day more is permitted, the ale is stronger, the rounds keep coming. Your neighbour is drinking more than you've ever seen him drink, and he is not being judged for it, because today that's what people do. Behaviour that would be noted on a Tuesday is simply part of the day. Someone has started singing. Someone has proposed a wrestling match, which is a genuinely popular medieval pastime, and which is about to go badly for at least one participant. Someone is weeping about his father. Someone has formed a deep and sincere emotional attachment to a barrel. Social permission has been granted collectively, and that is a far stronger force than any individual offer. For a man with a problem, this is the hardest day of the year. Not because the drink is more available, it has been available every day, but because on this day, refusing it means removing yourself from your own community's happiness in full public view, and there is no way to do that quietly. Now, the necessary correction, because I don't want to leave you with a cartoon. Medieval authorities did not regard festival drunkenness with amused tolerance. They complained about it constantly and furiously. Church ales in particular attracted criticism from within the church itself, on the grounds that holding a drinking party in or near consecrated ground on a holy day was not obviously compatible with the purpose of either. Bishops issued prohibitions. Reformers denounced them. There were repeated attempts across the centuries to restrict them, move them, or stop them entirely. They persisted anyway for the simplest reason imaginable. They raised money and the church needed money, and no alternative method raised nearly as much. That tension is worth holding on to, because it recurs everywhere in this story. The institution disapproves of the excess and depends on the mechanism that produces it. There were also real consequences. Court records show the aftermath of feast days with grim regularity: assaults, injuries, deaths, quarrels that began over nothing and ended with a knife. A large group of people drinking heavily in a society where most men carried a blade for entirely practical reasons was a genuinely dangerous combination, and everyone knew it. Some of the sharpest medieval condemnation of drunkenness comes from people who had recently watched what it did at a wedding. So the picture is not a society joyfully abandoning itself. It's a society that has built a calendar of collective release, understands exactly what that release costs, complains about it every year, and holds the festival again the following spring, because the alternative is a year with no shape in it at all. And now let's return to you standing at the edge of the churchyard with everything going on around you. Look at what has happened over these 7 sections. Alcohol has been handed to you as food, as wages, as religious allowance, as medicine, as hospitality, as the price of doing business, and now as the substance of communal joy itself. 7 doorways, not one of them built for the purpose, every one of them leading to the same room, and it would be easy to conclude that this is a society drowning, that everyone is drunk all the time, that the Middle Ages was one long blurred party. That conclusion would be entirely wrong, and the reason why is the most interesting thing left to say tonight. Because medieval people were not confused about this. They drew a line, and they drew it hard, and they enforced it with real ferocity. They distinguished absolutely between the man who drinks and the man who is a drunkard, and they did not confuse the two for a moment. The presence of drink everywhere did not mean the absence of judgment. It meant judgment fell somewhere different from where we would put it. So the question that has been hanging over this entire journey finally has to be asked directly. In a world that hands you a cup at breakfast, at work, at church, at the doctor, at your own door, at the market, and at the feast, at what precise point does this society decide that you drink too much? They had an answer, a specific, consistent, unforgiving answer, and it had nothing to do with how much was in the cup. Here is the answer, and it is going to surprise you with how modern it feels once you see it clearly. Medieval society did not measure your drinking by volume. It measured it by consequence. Nobody was counting your cups. There was no threshold, no quantity that tipped a man from acceptable to condemned, no standard by which a person could be assessed and found excessive. The question was never how much you drank. The question was what happened to you when you drank it, and what happened to everyone around you as a result, which means you could drink an amount that would alarm a modern doctor and attract no comment whatsoever, provided you continued to function, and you could drink considerably less and be ruined if the drinking showed. The line was drawn at self-command. To understand why, go back to the theology, because this is where it originates and the logic is remarkably tight. Drunkenness was condemned not for damaging the body, but for dissolving reason. Reason is the faculty that distinguishes a person from an animal, and it is the faculty by which a soul governs itself. A man who has surrendered his reason has surrendered the instrument of his own moral control, and once that's gone, everything else follows. That's why drunkenness was so often described as the gateway sin rather than as a sin standing alone. Preachers laid out the sequence with real relish. The man who loses his reason will quarrel, and the quarrel will become violence. He will speak what should not be spoken and betray what should not be betrayed. He will fall into lust, because the restraint that governed it is gone. He will waste what belongs to his household. He will neglect the duties owed to his family, his Lord and his God. Drunkenness was frightening not because of the drink, it was frightening because of the door it opened, and this is why the moral judgment attached itself to a person rather than to a behaviour. Medieval moral thinking cared enormously about what kind of man you were, and it had a category ready for you. Not someone who drank too much last night, which is a description of an evening. The drunkard, which is a description of a soul. It was a settled character, a permanent disposition, and once the word attached to your name, it was extraordinarily difficult to remove. Compare that to the position of an ordinary drinker. You have ale at dawn, you have more in the field. You have a cup with a guest, and a cup at the alehouse where you settled a debt, and a great deal more at the feast in May. That entire pattern generates no commentary at all. It isn't a pattern, it's just being alive in your century. The distinction, then, is not between drinking and not drinking. It's between the man who holds himself together and the man who does not. So how, in practice, does the judgment fall on you? Not through any official mechanism, at least not at first. It falls through your neighbours. And this is the part that modern people, cushioned by anonymity, genuinely struggle to feel the weight of. You have no privacy. Not in the sense of walls. Walls exist. But in the sense that matters. You live in a community of perhaps a few hundred people, most of whom you are related to or will do business with, all of whom you will see repeatedly for your entire life, none of whom you can escape by moving, because moving requires resources you do not have and a destination that would receive you. There is no fresh start. There is no city to disappear into. There is one audience, and it is permanent, and it has been watching you since you were born. Your reputation is not a soft thing. It's an economic asset with immediate cash value, and here's why. Almost all trade at your level runs on credit. You do not pay for things at the moment you receive them. You pay at harvest, or at the fair, or when the wool is sold. The entire local economy is a dense web of small debts held in people's heads and in the memory of witnesses. Credit requires trust. Trust requires reputation. And reputation is a public judgment about whether you are a person who does what he says. So watch what happens to the man who crosses the line. He misses work, not once. Once is a bad day, but often enough that it becomes a known thing. Employers stop hiring him because the harvest window is narrow and unreliable labour is worse than no labour. He wastes household resources. The grain that should have fed his family or been sold has instead been converted into ale and drunk, and in a household running close to the margin, that is not a lifestyle choice. That is his children going short, and everyone can see the children. He causes trouble, fights at the alehouse, insults thrown that cannot be taken back, damage done. And these things reach courts, because they are exactly the sort of matter manorial and borough courts existed to handle. Fines are levied. The record is written down. He becomes unreliable in the credit web. He borrows and doesn't repay. Word travels, and word travels very fast in a village. Soon nobody will extend to him, which means he cannot buy seed or tools or bread in a bad month, which accelerates everything. He becomes a burden on the parish because the parish is the welfare system, and a household that has collapsed through the failure of its head is a household the community will have to carry. That's the mechanism. It isn't dramatic, it's cumulative, and it's economic, and it happens through 1,000 small withdrawals of confidence by people who have known you your whole life and have finally concluded that you cannot be relied upon. You don't have an online reputation. You have something considerably worse. You have neighbours, and they remember absolutely everything. Now the church had its own tools, and they were not gentle. Drunkenness was a matter for confession and penance. In more serious or persistent cases, an individual could be brought before church courts, which dealt with moral offences and could face public penance, a genuinely humiliating punishment performed in front of the congregation, designed specifically to shame. Public shame was not a side effect of the system, it was the system. It was understood as the primary instrument of correction, because a person who has been shamed in front of everyone he knows has been given a powerful incentive to reform. Secular authorities in towns had their own responses, particularly for public disorder. Fines, stocks, and other public punishments were available, and the humiliation was again the point. So the society had a full apparatus for punishing the drunkard. What it did not have, and I want to state this plainly because it is the heart of the whole thing, was any apparatus at all for helping him. There was no framework in which drink could be understood as a condition rather than a failing. The vocabulary did not exist. The concept did not exist. A man who could not stop was not a man suffering from something. He was a man who had chosen badly and kept choosing badly, and whose soul was in danger as a direct result. The response to that was correction. Preaching, penance, shame, fines, and the withdrawal of the community's confidence, all of which are designed to make a person want to change, none of which do anything whatsoever for a person who wants to change and cannot. And so we arrive at the shape of the whole thing, which is genuinely strange when you lay it out. Medieval society placed alcohol at the centre of nearly every institution it had. In the home, in the workplace, in the church, in medicine, in hospitality, in commerce, in celebration. Not through carelessness, but because each of those institutions had entirely sound reasons of its own. And then it turned to every individual within that arrangement and said, without irony, exercise moderation. The entire burden of restraint was placed on personal virtue inside a structure that offered no support for it, no exit from it, and no recognised language for failing at it. And then failure was punished with shame. That is an extraordinarily demanding thing to ask of a human being, and most people managed it, which deserves saying, because the picture of a permanently drunken Middle Ages is nonsense. Most medieval people drank regularly and lived ordered lives. They had fields to work and families to feed and rents to pay, and there was no room in any of that for a man who couldn't get up in the morning. The system worked most of the time, for most people. But for the ones it didn't work for, there was nothing. No help, no framework, no path back except the sheer force of individual will applied continuously in a world where the substance was in your hand at breakfast. Which brings us to the last question, and it's the one that finally explains why none of this could ever have been changed. Because eventually the authorities did act. They looked at the disorder, the violence, the court cases, the ruined households, and they moved. And what they did next tells you everything about how deeply this went. They didn't restrict it, they didn't reduce it, they didn't attempt at any point to remove it. They regulated it, they measured it, they licensed it, they inspected it, they wrote it into law with astonishing care and detail, and then, with genuine enthusiasm, they taxed it. Because by that point, an enormous number of people were making a living from your cup, and the crown itself had noticed how much money was sitting inside it. By now the authorities have seen enough. They have the court rolls in front of them. They know what comes out of the alehouse on a Saturday. They know how many disputes begin over a dice game and end with a man bleeding in the street. They know which households have collapsed and which widows are now the parish's problem. They have watched a feast day produce 3 assaults and a funeral. So surely this is the moment. Surely someone in authority finally stands up and says that a society which places drink at breakfast, at work, at church, at the doctor, at the door, at the market and at the festival has perhaps created an obvious difficulty for itself. They don't. Not once, anywhere in medieval Europe, does anyone seriously propose removing it. The idea doesn't appear because it is not thinkable. You cannot prohibit a foodstuff. You cannot prohibit wages. You cannot prohibit the sacrament. You cannot prohibit hospitality, or the only public building in the parish, or the mechanism that pays for the church roof. So they do the other thing. The thing every government in history does when confronted with something universal, profitable, and troublesome. They write rules about it, and the rules are magnificent in their way because of how specific they are. This is not vague moral guidance, this is bureaucracy arriving in Europe with its sleeves rolled up. Take England, where the machinery is particularly well documented. From the 13th century, the assize of bread and ale set out how the price of ale should relate to the price of the grain it was made from. The principle is straightforward and rather admirable. Ale is a necessity, grain prices fluctuate, and a seller should not be able to exploit a bad year. So the price is pegged, adjusted as corn prices move, and enforced locally. Enforced by whom? By officials appointed for the purpose. The ale taster, and the title is not a joke, it's an actual office in manorial and borough administration, was responsible for checking that ale offered for sale was of proper quality and sold at the proper price in the proper measure. Brewers were expected to announce when a batch was ready and to have it inspected before selling. And measure mattered enormously, because measure is where cheating lives. If nobody standardizes the vessel, the seller simply uses a smaller one. So authorities specified measures, checked them, and destroyed false ones. A great many medieval regulations across Europe are, at bottom, arguments about the size of a cup. Then there are the penalties, and this is where the court records become almost comic in their regularity. Manorial court rolls across England are stuffed with fines against brewers for breaking the assize, selling above price, selling short measure, selling before inspection, selling poor stuff. But look closely at those fines and something curious appears. The same names recur, year after year, the same women, fined again and again, continuing to brew and sell throughout, which tells you what the fine actually was. It was not a punishment intended to stop the activity. It was, in practice, a license fee, a regular, expected, budgeted cost of doing business, collected annually by a lord or borough who had every interest in the trade continuing, since it generated the revenue. Medieval authority looked at ale selling and said, in effect, we're keeping this, but we're going to need paperwork and a small annual contribution. And there's a second pattern buried in those same roles, and it's a darker one. As brewing shifted over the later medieval period from a domestic, largely female activity into a more commercial, capitalised, increasingly male trade, driven partly by the arrival of hopped beer from the continent, which kept far longer, travelled better, and rewarded larger-scale production and investment, the alewives who had dominated the trade were gradually pushed out of it. Larger operations needed capital, premises, equipment, and access to guilds and formal structures that women were often excluded from. The woman brewing a surplus in her kitchen could not compete with a brewhouse, producing at volume for a regional market. The regulation of drink is therefore also, quietly, the story of a trade being taken away from the people who had built it. Then there's the other half of the regulatory effort, aimed not at the producer, but at the premises. Because the alehouse is where authorities' real anxieties gather. Towns across Europe issued ordinances attempting to control the drinking house and its inhabitants. Rules about closing times, because people awake after dark are people up to something. Rules about who could be served and for how long. Rules about gaming, since dice and gambling were seen as the engine of both ruin and violence. Rules aimed at prostitution, which was associated with such establishments and variously prohibited, restricted, or confined to specific quarters. Rules about weapons and about brawling. Rules holding the keeper responsible for disorder occurring under his roof. Some of the finer details are wonderfully human. There were places that restricted the serving of drink during church services on the reasonable suspicion that a certain portion of the congregation had made an alternative arrangement for Sunday morning. But now step back and look at the entire body of regulation together, because the shape of it is the point. Every rule assumes the drinking continues. Price controls assume people will buy ale and try to ensure they aren't cheated. Quality inspection assumes people will drink it and tries to ensure it isn't foul. Measure enforcement assumes the transaction and polices its fairness. Closing hours assume the alehouse and merely constrain its timetable. Licensing assumes the seller and simply extracts a payment from him. Not one of these instruments is aimed at reduction. Every one of them is aimed at order. The medieval state's position on alcohol is not that there is too much of it. The position is that it must be sold honestly at a fair price, in an accurate cup by a person who is paid, at a reasonable hour without anyone getting stabbed. And once you see that, the final piece falls into place, because there's a reason the state was never going to attack this trade, and the reason is money. Follow your cup backwards and count the livelihoods attached to it. Someone grew the barley, someone harvested it, someone malted it, which is a skilled trade in its own right. Someone milled it, and the miller paid for that right and passed the cost on. Someone brewed it. A cooper made the barrel, and coopering was a substantial craft with its own guild in many towns. Potters made the vessels, carters moved the casks, the alehouse keeper sold it, and around the edges the labourers, servants and family members whose work supported every one of those stages. Now do the same for wine, where the chain is longer and richer. Vineyards, presses, cooperage, and then transport at scale. River barges, carts, and ships. The wine trade between the Gascon vineyards and England was one of the great commercial arteries of medieval Europe, and it moved genuinely enormous quantities. Ports were built around it. Merchant fortunes were made on it. Shipping, warehousing, brokerage, retail, an entire international commercial ecosystem existed to move fermented grape juice northward, and it employed a great many people who had never tasted the stuff they were handling. And at every joint in that chain, authority took its cut. Tolls on rivers and roads, customs duties at ports, and the wine custom was a significant, dependable source of royal revenue, the kind of income a crown builds its budget around. Market dues, fines, license payments, fees for weights and measures, taxes on the trade voted by assemblies when a king needed money for a war, which was constantly. Your drinking is not merely tolerated, it is fiscally load-bearing. Congratulations, your habit is helping to fund public administration and, quite possibly, a military campaign in France. So now imagine standing up in that world and proposing that people should drink considerably less. You are proposing to reduce the income of every brewer and alewife in the district. You are proposing to cut the market for the grain that farmers grow and landlords collect as rent. You are proposing to empty the coopers' workshops, idle the carters, close the alehouses, cripple the wine fleet, and remove one of the most reliable revenue streams the Crown possesses. You are proposing that the parish find some other way to repair its roof, and that the harvest be brought in by workers who are paid entirely in coin the employer would now have to find. You will not be popular, you will not be listened to, and you will not be given a position of any responsibility whatsoever. That is the true architecture underneath everything we've covered tonight. Not appetite, not weakness, interest. Alcohol was not merely present in medieval life, it was structural. It was food, wage, sacrament, medicine, manners, commerce, celebration, and revenue. And each of those attachments was held in place by people who had something real to lose if it were removed. A society can regulate a thing like that. It can moralize about it endlessly, and it did. It can punish the men who fail at it, and it did that too, with public shame and fines and the slow withdrawal of a community's trust. What it cannot do is get rid of it. Not because it lacked the will, but because by then the thing had grown into the load-bearing walls, and you cannot take out a wall because you dislike what's hanging on it. Which leaves one question, and it's the one this whole journey has been walking toward. If that's what the world was, if that's genuinely how it was built, then what did it actually feel like to be the one person inside it who could not stop? Let's go back to the beginning, and let's walk the whole day again, now that you know what you're looking at. You woke in a room that smelled of smoke, in a bed made of straw, and there was ale beside your bread. Nobody remarked on it. Your mother, or your wife, or your daughter had made it in that room and would start the next batch before the morning was out, because unhopped ale does not wait, and the household needs it the way it needs flour. You went to work, and your employer put a jug at the edge of the field because that was part of what he owed you. It was written into your wage, and if you'd asked for coin instead, you'd have got less of it. You went looking for restraint at the monastery and found a brew house run by men with 2 centuries of accumulated technique and a daily allowance set out in a rule written before your kingdom existed. You went to a physician, and he read your body through a theory 1,000 years old and told you, in complete sincerity and with real professional care, that wine would help. You went home and shut your door and someone knocked, and the oldest obligation in your culture required you to fill a cup for him. You went to conduct honest business and found that the only room in your community where an agreement could be witnessed and made binding was a room that sold ale. And then the calendar turned and the whole parish gathered in the churchyard, and the ale that paid for the roof was poured, and to refuse a cup was to stand outside your own community's happiness in front of every person you would ever know. 7 doorways. Not one of them built to lead you here. That's the thing I want to leave you with, more than any other. Nobody designed this. There was no conspiracy of appetite, no civilization that decided to organize itself around drink. What happened was that 7 separate institutions, each pursuing an entirely reasonable purpose of its own, feeding people, paying them, worshipping, healing, welcoming, trading, celebrating, each independently arrived at alcohol as the sensible tool for the job, and they were, by their own lights, correct every time. The result was not a plan. It was an accumulation, and an accumulation is much harder to argue with than a plan, because there's nobody to argue with. So let's finally answer the question, and answer it honestly. The title says medieval society was built for alcoholics. It wasn't. That's the joke, and now that we've walked through it, you can see exactly why it's a joke. Medieval people were not indifferent to this. They saw the ruin. They wrote about it constantly and with real anger. Preachers described the drunkard's descent in vivid, unsparing detail from pulpits across Europe, week after week, for centuries. Moralists catalogued precisely what he lost: his reason, his household's grain, his wife's security, his children's food, his standing, his soul. Courts fined him. Congregations shamed him. Neighbours withdrew their credit and their confidence, which in that world was a slow economic execution. Nobody watched a man drink himself into the ditch and considered it charming. There was no tolerance whatsoever for the person who lost control. If anything, the judgment was harsher than ours, because it wasn't a judgment about behaviour, it was a judgment about what kind of soul you were. So this was not a society that approved. It was something considerably stranger. It was a society that condemned the outcome while building, brick by brick, out of entirely honourable materials, the most complete delivery system for that outcome that any civilization had yet produced. And then it turned to each individual standing inside it and said, "Exercise moderation. That's the whole thing. That's the entire strange heart of it. Everyone agrees you shouldn't drink too much. And then they hand you another cup because it's harvest, because you're a guest, because you're ill, because it's a holy day, because we're settling a price, because it's Tuesday and this is what people drink." A remarkably ambitious approach to public health. Now, the part that matters most, and the part on you've been holding back all night. We've talked about structures and institutions and economics, and it's easy to keep the whole thing at that distance, where it stays interesting and safely historical. But somewhere inside every one of those villages was a person for whom none of this was a system. It was just a life, going wrong, slowly, in public. Try to imagine it properly. You cannot avoid the substance because it's in your house before you're awake and it was made by someone you love. You cannot avoid it at work because refusing it doesn't get you more money, it gets you a reputation. You cannot avoid it socially because refusal reads as insult, suspicion, or shame, and there is no explanation available to you that anyone would accept. You cannot move away because there is nowhere to go and no means to get there and no community that would take you in unknown. You cannot be treated because the concept of treatment does not exist. The idea that a person might be unable to stop, as opposed to unwilling, has not been invented. There is no word for what is happening to you. You cannot even confess it privately and get practical help, because the response available to your priest is penance and exhortation. He will tell you to be stronger. He means it kindly. It will not work, and when it doesn't, the failure will be understood as yours alone. And all of this happens in front of everyone you have ever known, for the rest of your life, with no possibility of anonymity and no second act. That's not a comedy. That's just a person, alone, inside a world that had accidentally made his particular kind of suffering both universal in its causes and completely invisible in its nature. We've spent this whole journey laughing at the absurdity, at the monk checking the fermentation after praying against temptation, at the physician prescribing wine, at the host refilling a cup neither man wanted. And the absurdity is real, and it's funny, and I don't take any of it back. But underneath it there was a man who couldn't stop, and there was nothing there for him. Not a single thing. That's the honest ending, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close. So what does medieval drinking actually tell us? Not that they were degenerate, they weren't. Most medieval people drank regularly and lived tightly ordered, demanding competent lives because they had to. There were fields to work and rents to pay and children to keep alive through the winter, and none of that leaves room for a man who can't get up. The system functioned for most people, most of the time. What it tells us is something less comfortable, which is that the availability of a thing is not a moral position. It's an accident of how a society solved its other problems. Medieval Europe put alcohol everywhere, not because it valued intoxication, but because it valued nourishment, work, worship, healing, welcome, trade, and joy. And alcohol happened to be a useful instrument for all seven. And it tells us that a culture can hold two entirely contradictory positions with complete sincerity and no discomfort at all. That excess is shameful, and that the cup should never be empty. Nobody in that world experienced those as being in tension. They simply lived inside both. Which raises the question I'd genuinely like you to think about after this ends, and I'm not going to answer it for you. What is in the load-bearing walls of your own century? What does your world hand you at every doorway, for reasons each of which is perfectly sensible on its own terms, while simultaneously telling you to be moderate about it? What will look, 800 years from now, as obvious to someone else as the ale at breakfast looks to us? Because the medieval villager didn't see a system. He just saw breakfast, and so, finally, back to where we started. You woke up, and there was a cup beside the bread, and you drank it without a thought, because it was food, and it was morning, and that was simply how the day began. You didn't need an excuse to drink. You needed one not to. That's the world. That's the whole thing. Not a drunken carnival, not a civilization staggering through 8 centuries, but something quieter and much harder to escape. An ordinary life, in an ordinary village, in which the thing was simply always there, in your hand, offered by someone who loved you, or employed you, or was pleased to see you, on a morning that looked exactly like every other. If you made it all the way here with me tonight, thank you. Genuinely. These journeys are long by design, and there's something I find quite moving about the fact that people choose to spend this much time in the past with a voice they've never met. If it kept you company, a like helps more than you'd think, and if you'd like more of these, subscribing means the next one finds you. Tell me in the comments where you were listening from and what time it was when you got here. I always read them, and the geography of it never stops being extraordinary. And if you've been lying awake through all of this, I hope the medieval village was a decent place to rest for a while. Sleep well, history lovers. I'll see you next time.